Before we get into tonight's story, a quick thank you to Dogface680. If you have a story idea, a mystery, a conspiracy, something that keeps you up at night, drop it in the comments below. I read every single one. Now settle in, get comfortable, and let's talk about the Superstition Mountains and the curse that was never really a curse at all. There is a place in the American Southwest where the desert does not simply end. It rises. It erupts from the flat, sun-bleached earth in jagged volcanic formations, in sheer canyon walls of blackened rust and deep arterial red, in towers of ancient stone that lean over the land like judges passing sentence on anyone foolish enough to enter. The Superstition Mountains of central Arizona do not invite you. They tolerate you briefly, and then they take you. They have been taking people for a very long time. On the morning of March 14th, 2024, a search and rescue team from the Maricopa County Sheriff's Office received a distress ping from a GPS locator device registered to a man named Gerald Ashmore, age 52, a prospector and amateur geologist from Tucson who had filed a solo exploration permit 3 days earlier. The ping placed him approximately 2.7 miles northeast of Weaver's Needle, the most iconic formation in the Superstition Wilderness, a volcanic spine of rock that rises like a broken tooth from the desert floor. By the time the helicopter reached the coordinates, there was no Gerald Ashmore. There was only silence, the creak of wind through canyon walls, and the long shadows that the mountains cast over the valley below, like something ancient pulling the light back into itself. Rangers located his camp the following morning. His tent was intact, his water supply almost untouched. His sleeping bag was unrolled but had not been slept in. His camp stove still held a half-full propane canister. Nothing had been taken. Nothing had been disturbed. The only thing missing was Gerald Ashmore himself, and whatever he had seen in the mountains the night before. It would take search teams 11 more days to find his body, wedged into a narrow ravine on the eastern slope of a formation locals call the Flat Iron, a place where the topographic maps show nothing unusual, where there are no marked trails, where experienced hikers would have no reason to venture without a specific and deliberate destination in mind. The official cause of death was listed as exposure and dehydration, complicated by a fall. The case was closed within 48 hours of the body's recovery. What the official report did not mention, what it could not mention, because the documentation had already been removed from the evidence chain before the coroner's examination, was what the rangers found inside Gerald Ashmore's backpack. There were maps, hand-drawn on yellowed paper, in a style that matched cartographic techniques from the mid-20th century, showing a network of mine shafts and tunnels beneath the western face of the Superstitions. There was a magnifying loupe for mineral examination, still warm from his body heat when they recovered it. There was a field notebook filled with observations that referenced specific compass anomalies, unusual rock formations, and what he described as a metallic taste in the air that grew stronger the deeper he moved into a particular canyon system. And there was a Geiger counter, a modern digital model, not antique, not decorative, with a notation taped to its casing in Gerald Ashmore's handwriting. The radiation spikes at sunset. Do not stay after dark. The rangers photographed the contents. The photographs were logged. The physical items were transported to the evidence facility in Mesa. By the time a reporter filed a public records request for the incident documentation 2 weeks later, the photographs of the backpack contents had been removed from the file. The items themselves had been transferred to a federal agency, whose name on the transfer form was partially redacted. The form number corresponded to a designation used by the United States Department of Energy. The case of Gerald Ashmore officially was a simple tragedy. A man went into the desert alone. He got lost. He died. It happens in Arizona with the depressing regularity that the desert demands from those who underestimate it. But Gerald Ashmore was not a careless man. He had been entering the Superstitions for more than 20 years. He knew every trail. He knew the water sources, the weather patterns, the way the heat moved through the canyons in the late afternoon. He was not the kind of man who got lost. He was the kind of man who found things. And whatever he found in that canyon on the night of March 13th, 2024, was something that certain people in certain federal offices apparently could not allow to remain in the public record. This is where the story of the Superstition Mountains begins, not in some distant century of myth and legend, but here, now, in the age of GPS coordinates and digital evidence chains and federal transfer forms with redacted agency names. The curse of these mountains did not end when the frontier closed. It adapted. Long before any European prospector set foot in the Sonoran Desert, long before the Spanish colonial expeditions pushed north through the territory that would eventually become Arizona, the people who lived in and around what would become the Superstition Wilderness knew the mountains as something other than a geological feature. The Western Apache, who had maintained their relationship with this landscape for generations beyond the reach of written history, had specific and carefully maintained traditions about certain areas within the range. These were not generalized superstitions about mountain spirits or the dangers of the wilderness. They were precise, specific, locationally exact in ways that modern researchers have found genuinely difficult to explain. The Apache name for the mountains, loosely transliterated, carries within it a concept that early Anglo translators rendered as the place where the earth burns, not where fire has burned, not where the sun burns, where the earth itself burns, an ongoing internal process, something emanating from beneath the ground rather than descending from above. Warriors who entered certain drainages within the range reported physical symptoms that the Apache described through their own medical framework. A sensation of heat from the ground beneath their feet even in cool weather. A persistent metallic taste in the mouth that grew stronger with proximity to certain rock formations. Disorientation that struck suddenly and without warning, causing experienced trackers to lose their sense of direction. In terrain they had travelled dozens of times before. In more serious cases, a skin condition described as a burning rash that appeared without any external cause. These were not vague reports of spiritual unease. They were clinical observations, filtered through a cultural framework that interpreted them as evidence of something powerful and dangerous residing within the rock itself. The thunder gods, in Apache tradition, were beings of enormous and destructive power who lived within the mountains and expressed their displeasure at human intrusion through fire, through noise, through the kind of physical punishment that left a man broken and disoriented on the canyon floor. Apache war parties avoided certain approaches to the mountains entirely, not out of superstition in the modern dismissive sense of the word, but out of practical, experience-based caution. People who crossed into those specific zones came back wrong, or they did not come back at all. When you set this traditional knowledge alongside what we now understand about uranium geology, about the effects of ionizing radiation on the human body, about the way that certain geological formations in the American Southwest contain extraordinarily high concentrations of radioactive ore, a different picture emerges. The Apache were not wrong. They were accurate observers of real phenomena, describing through the only interpretive framework available to them what was, in fact, a genuine and measurable physical danger. The Earth in those specific locations does burn, in a sense. It emits energy. It disrupts compass needles through its magnetic and electromagnetic effects. It causes the metallic taste that comes from radiation affecting the saliva and mucous membranes. It produces the skin irritation that comes from direct contact with radioactive mineral dust. It disorients through a combination of physiological effects and magnetic field disruption that can compromise an experienced navigator's sense of direction within minutes of exposure. The thunder gods were the mountains themselves. The curse was geology, and the people who understood it best were the ones who were systematically pushed off the land and out of the conversation when the men with the picks and the promises arrived. In the winter of 1871, a man named Jacob Waltz walked into the office of a Phoenix land registry and filed a prospecting claim for mineral exploration rights in the eastern Maricopa County Territory, in the area around the Superstition Mountains. He was 53 years old, a German immigrant who had come to America in 1839 and spent the intervening decades working his way across the continent toward the Western Territories in the tradition of thousands of other men for whom the promise of mineral wealth in the American West represented the only viable path to economic security. He had worked claims in California and Nevada and New Mexico. He was not a lucky prospector by most accounts, and not a particularly successful one. But by the middle of the 1870s, something had changed. He was spending money he did not appear to have legitimate income to support. He was paying for supplies in gold, not gold coin, but raw gold ore, nuggets and dust that assayers in Phoenix and Mesa examined with the kind of careful attention that genuine high-grade specimens always attracted. The gold was remarkable. Multiple assay records from the period, some of which survive in the Arizona State Archives, note that the ore Waltz brought in contained unusually pure vein gold with a purity grade that put it among the highest quality specimens seen in the Arizona Territory. What the assay reports also noted in the dry technical language of the period that did not then have the interpretive framework to fully understand what it was observing was that the ore contained trace mineral inclusions of a type that geologists of the era associated with deep primary deposits, formations that had not been exposed to the surface weathering processes that degraded most accessible ore. The specific mineral trace that appears in multiple assay records from this period, described variously as a dark metallite inclusion or a heavy metallic accessory mineral, was, based on the physical descriptions, almost certainly uraninite, the primary ore mineral of uranium, occurring naturally within the gold-bearing vein formation. Jacob Waltz knew exactly where his mine was. He returned to it multiple times over a period of more than 15 years, always alone, always on foot, always entering the mountains from a different direction to prevent anyone from tracking his route. He spoke about it with a handful of people over those years. Neighbours, a saloon keeper in Phoenix, a woman named Julia Thomas, who would become the central figure in the final chapter of his life. But he never provided usable directions to anyone. He described it in ways that were simultaneously detailed and impossible to follow. A mine entrance visible from a certain ridge only when the sun was in a specific position. A landmark stone formation that could only be seen from inside a particular canyon. A series of compass bearings taken from reference points that no one else could reliably identify. Whether this was deliberate obfuscation, or simply the imprecise recollection of a man who navigated primarily by deep familiarity with terrain rather than formal coordinates, is impossible to know. What is clear is that he took the precise location with him when he died. Jacob Waltz died on October 25, 1891, in the Phoenix home of Julia Thomas, an ice cream shop owner who had taken him in after he became too ill and too old to continue his desert prospecting alone. In his final days, feverish and intermittently delirious, he described his mine to her in fragments. The canyon, the needle-shaped rock formation that served as the primary landmark, the direction of the entrance, the depth of the vein. Julia Thomas spent years after his death searching for the mine, hiring guides, organising expeditions, eventually selling hand-drawn treasure maps to anyone who would buy them to recoup the enormous cost of her search efforts. She never found it. Hundreds of people who followed her maps never found it. But what strikes anyone who examines the historical record of Jacob Waltz's final years closely is not the mystery of the mine's location. It is the mystery of his death. He was, by the testimony of everyone who knew him in his final years, a man of extraordinary physical constitution. He had spent decades doing the most physically demanding labour the American frontier offered, in some of the most brutal desert terrain on the continent. He was tough. He was hardened. And then, beginning in the late 1880s, he began to decline with a speed and a specificity that the medical understanding of the era could not fully account for. He suffered from persistent weakness and fatigue. He developed sores on his skin that would not heal. He lost weight rapidly. His hair thinned. He experienced bouts of severe nausea and disorientation. The Phoenix physician who attended him in his final months documented these symptoms carefully but could find no clear diagnosis. The standard diseases of the era, tuberculosis, typhoid, various parasitic infections, did not match the clinical picture. He died of something that manifested like a systemic failure of every organ in his body simultaneously, a progressive and catastrophic breakdown of his physical health over a period of approximately 3 to 4 years. That is what acute radiation syndrome looks like when it develops slowly through long-term, repeated exposure rather than a single high-dose event. Chronic radiation poisoning from years of working in close contact with high-grade uranium ore, breathing the radon gas that naturally emanates from uranium formations, handling radioactive mineral specimens with bare hands, eating and drinking in proximity to radioactive dust, without any awareness of the danger. Jacob Waltz did not know what was killing him. No one in 1891 knew what uranium was capable of. Marie Curie would not publish her foundational research on radioactivity for another 7 years. The concept of ionizing radiation as a biological hazard was not part of anyone's intellectual framework. Waltz simply grew sick and died, and everyone around him attributed it to the accumulated toll of a hard life in a hard country. Nobody thought to look at the ore. The Peralta family's story is older than Jacob Waltz's, and it is written in blood. The legend, and the historical record supports at least the broad outlines of it, holds that a Mexican mining family named Peralta, or possibly a series of family-connected expeditions operating under the Peralta name, was mining gold in the Superstitions in the years before the American annexation of the Arizona Territory, which became official in 1848 following the Mexican-American War. The family allegedly operated multiple claims in the mountains, extracting significant quantities of gold ore and transporting it south to Mexico in periodic pack train expeditions. At some point in the mid-1840s, the exact date varies depending on the source, one of those expeditions was ambushed. The historical question is by whom? Apache warriors are the most commonly cited perpetrators, and the Apache were certainly active in the region and had every reason to resist the presence of foreign mining operations on territory they controlled. But some researchers, looking at the physical evidence recovered from the massacre site over the subsequent decades, the scattered mule bones, the fragmentary equipment, the occasional human remains, have noted details that suggest the confrontation was more complex than a simple Apache raid. The manner in which the bodies were found, when they were found, showed signs of injury patterns that are difficult to reconcile entirely with the standard tactics of Apache warfare in the period. More intriguingly, the few physical descriptions of the victims recorded by American military personnel who surveyed the area in the early 1850s mention skin conditions and physical abnormalities that are, again, difficult to explain through any conventional historical framework. The Peralta family had been mining the same formation that Jacob Waltz would later mine. They had been extracting the same ore, processing it with the same primitive techniques, handling it with the same complete ignorance of its invisible additional properties. The men who worked those mines for months or years at a time would have been experiencing the cumulative effects of radiation exposure, the fatigue, the cognitive impairment, the immune suppression that made them vulnerable to other illnesses, the skin lesions that come from contact with radioactive mineral dust. They were sick men before anyone attacked them. Their deaths in the mountains were the culmination of a process that had begun the first day they broke open a vein and breathed the dust of what they thought was simply gold-bearing rock. The story of Adolph Ruth is, in the annals of Superstition Mountain disappearances, the case that most clearly marks the transition from legend to documented historical tragedy. Ruth was 66 years old in June of 1931, a Washington, D.C. resident whose son, Erwin Ruth, had obtained what he claimed were original Peralta treasure maps through a Mexican land transaction in the 19-teens. Adolph Ruth had spent years studying those maps, corresponding with historians and prospectors, building what he believed was a definitive case for the location of the lost Dutchman mine. In June of 1931, despite his advanced age, despite a hip injury that limited his mobility, Despite the fact that he would be travelling alone in one of the most unforgiving desert environments in North America, he went in. He arranged to be dropped at a ranch near the trailhead. He carried the Peralta maps, a compass, a canteen, supplies for several weeks. He wrote a cheerful letter to his son from the ranch, promising to wire once he had confirmed the mine's location. He walked into the mountains, and he did not come out. Search parties were organised in the summer and again in the fall, finding nothing. His remains were finally located in December of 1931, approximately half a mile from where he had last been seen, close enough to his entry point that the discovery raised immediate questions about how experienced searchers had failed to find him over the preceding months. What the searchers found was deeply strange. His skull had been separated from the rest of his skeleton, which itself was scattered over a considerable area, consistent with animal scavenging over the months of exposure. But the skull showed what multiple examiners described as 2 holes in the cranial bone, positioned in locations that some medical experts argued were consistent with bullet wounds. The debate over what killed Adolf Ruth consumed considerable attention in the Arizona press of the period, and it has never been fully resolved. The official conclusion was that he died of thirst and exposure, that the skull damage was caused by animal activity post-mortem, and that his scattered remains were simply the result of months of desert scavenging. This explanation is not impossible. It is also not entirely satisfying given the specific location and nature of the cranial damage. Near his remains, searchers found a note in his handwriting. It was water-damaged and partially illegible, but one phrase was clearly readable, and it has been quoted and analysed ever since. A reference to having found, or being close to, a vein of gold that matched the description in his Peralta maps. Whether this was triumphant discovery or exhausted delusion, the notation of a dying man whose dehydrated and radiation-compromised mind was generating visions of what he most wanted to find is impossible to determine. What is certain is that he died in those mountains, in a location that experienced search parties should have found months earlier, under circumstances that the official record refuses to fully explain. The year 1945 changed everything. Not just the course of the war, not just the geopolitical architecture of the 20th century, but the way that the United States government looked at its own geology. The Trinity test on July 16th, 1945, the first detonation of a nuclear device, inaugurated a new era of strategic resource anxiety. The Manhattan Project had consumed enormous quantities of uranium sourced primarily from the Belgian Congo and from Canadian deposits. As the Cold War took shape in the months and years following Hiroshima and Nagasaki, as it became clear that the Soviet Union was moving aggressively toward its own nuclear weapons capability, the United States government understood with urgent clarity that domestic uranium supply was a matter of national security. A nation that depended on foreign sources for the raw material of its most powerful weapons was a nation with a dangerous vulnerability. The United States Geological Survey, the Atomic Energy Commission, established by the Atomic Energy Act of 1946, and various military and intelligence adjacent agencies launched the most comprehensive mineral survey of the American West in the country's history. Survey teams fanned out across the Colorado Plateau, the Great Basin, the Sonoran Desert, the Rocky Mountain states. They were looking for uranium specifically, with the single-mindedness of a gold rush turned to national security purpose. They had aerial radiometric survey equipment. They had ground-penetrating analysis tools. They had for the first time a clear scientific understanding of what they were looking for and sophisticated methods for finding it. In the late 1940s, survey teams entered the Superstition Mountains. The specific reports generated by those surveys remain classified, not in the half-hearted, practically accessible way that many mid-century government documents are technically classified while being substantively available through FOIA requests, but classified in the harder, more deliberate way that suggests the information is still considered sensitive by someone with the authority to maintain that sensitivity. What can be inferred from public records, from the pattern of subsequent land use decisions, from the behaviour of federal agencies toward mining claims in the area, from the documented activities of the AEC in the region during this period, is that the surveys found something significant. Beginning in the late 1940s and accelerating through the 1950s, a series of administrative actions quietly reshaped the relationship between the federal government and the Superstition Mountains. Mining claims that had been filed and approved in previous decades were quietly denied renewal. Access roads that private parties had maintained were allowed to fall into disrepair without the usual federal maintenance assistance. Airspace above certain portions of the range was brought under monitoring protocols that were not publicly announced. The area was eventually incorporated into the Tonto National Forest and subsequently designated as wilderness, a designation that, while presented entirely in terms of environmental preservation, had the additional and considerably more significant practical effect of making the terrain legally inaccessible to any private mineral extraction operation. The official explanation was conservation. The American conservation movement was indeed gaining momentum in this period, and the Superstition Wilderness designation was publicly framed in entirely those terms. But the timing is instructive. The land use changes occurred precisely in the period when AEC survey activity in the region was at its most intense. The access restrictions were implemented in exactly the pattern you would expect if the government had identified specific zones of hazardous, radioactive material that it needed to contain. Not by cleanup, which was not yet technically feasible, but by exclusion, by keeping people out, by ensuring that no private mining operation would accidentally break open a uranium-bearing formation and scatter radioactive ore across the desert floor, or worse, begin extracting it for commercial purposes without the safety protocols that the AEC was simultaneously developing for its own controlled extraction operations. The Lost Dutchman mine, if the conspiracy framework is correct, was not lost at all. It was found, it was assessed, it was determined to be something that the federal government needed to control. And the most elegant, most historically resonant, most perfectly designed method of controlling access to it was the one that already existed, the legend itself. Herman Petrash's story is less well known than Adolf Ruth's, which is itself less well known than Jacob Waltz's, which creates a kind of diminishing visibility as you move forward in time. Each successive death slightly less documented, slightly more easily explained away, slightly less likely to accumulate the kind of public attention that demands answers. Herman Petrash was an experienced prospector who had been searching for the Lost Dutchman mine since the 1910s, a man who had built up over decades a comprehensive knowledge of the Superstition Mountains and a collection of historical documentation about the mine that was, by the 1940s when he disappeared, among the most extensive private archives on the subject in existence. He had survived the mountains many times. He knew their moods, their water sources, their dangerous sections, the way the heat concentrated in certain drainages and made navigation treacherous in the afternoon hours. He was not a reckless man. He was methodical, careful, experienced. And then he went into the mountains in the mid-1940s and did not come back from a particular drainage on the western slope of the range. His field journals from the years preceding his death are a remarkable document. They describe, in the careful language of a man trained to observe and record geological information, a series of anomalies that he found in the area he was most focused on. He noted that certain sections of canyon wall felt warm to the touch even in cool weather, describing it as a heat that seemed to come from inside the rock rather than absorbed from sunlight. He described a persistent metallic taste in the mouth that he could not attribute to any food or water source. It came and went in specific locations, stronger in some canyons than others. Most significantly, he described a compass behaviour that he could not explain, a persistent deflection of his compass needle in a specific drainage that made accurate navigation impossible, and that he attempted to account for through various hypotheses, none of which satisfied him. His final journal entries, written from within the mountains on what turned out to be among his last expeditions, describe a fatigue and mental fogginess that he found alarming and unusual. Every one of those symptoms, the heat from rock formations, the metallic taste, the compass deflection, the cognitive impairment presenting as fatigue and mental fogginess, is consistent with proximity to high-grade uranium ore deposits. The heat is real. Radioactive decay generates thermal energy, and a sufficiently concentrated ore body will produce measurable localized warmth. The metallic taste is real. Ionizing radiation affects the mucous membranes and salivary chemistry in ways that create precisely this sensation. The compass deflection is real. Uranium ore bodies are frequently associated with ferrous mineral formations that create local magnetic anomalies. And the cognitive impairment is profoundly real. Acute radiation exposure attacks the nervous system, causing the exact symptoms Petrash described: confusion, fatigue, difficulty with navigation and decision-making, before progressing to more severe physiological consequences. He did not know what was happening to him. No one knew. The biological effects of radiation exposure were understood in 1943 only in the most preliminary terms, and that understanding was itself among the most closely guarded secrets in the world, sequestered within the Manhattan Project's security apparatus. Herman Petrash was being killed by something that his civilization had only recently identified and already classified. His body was recovered in rough terrain that his journals suggested he had successfully navigated many times before. The official record describes his death as the result of a fall and exposure. The unofficial record, his own handwriting in those final journal entries, describes a man whose cognitive faculties were progressively failing him in a specific geographic area in which he had previously been entirely competent. In 1958, according to documentation assembled by independent researchers from a combination of declassified USGS records, Freedom of Information Act requests, and the accounts of several retired federal employees who spoke on condition of anonymity in the 1990s, a classified geological survey operation was conducted in the Superstition Mountains. The operation has been identified in partial documents under a project designation that appears, in the fragments that have survived the declassification process, to reference both a geological assessment and a containment evaluation, a dual purpose that is itself revealing. You conduct a geological assessment when you're trying to understand what is in the ground. You conduct a containment evaluation when you have already determined that what is in the ground poses a hazard that needs to be managed. The survey mapped uranium density across the western and central portions of the range with a precision that previous aerial surveys had not achieved. It assessed the structural geology of the primary ore-bearing formations, the conditions under which the ore existed, the stability of the surrounding rock, the likelihood of surface exposure through erosion or seismic activity, and it evaluated the specific risk posed by treasure hunters and prospectors who were, throughout this period, continuing to enter the mountains in significant numbers, following the trails laid down by the Lost Dutchman legend, blundering, in the federal government's assessment, directly into areas of serious radiological hazard. The solution was both practical and aesthetically satisfying in its use of existing cultural material. The federal government did not need to actively propagate the Lost Dutchman legend. It was already propagating itself with remarkable effectiveness. Every new disappearance, every mysterious death, every expedition that returned with nothing but confused accounts of strange compass behaviour and inexplicable illness added another layer to the mythology. The legend kept people afraid, kept them uncertain, kept them from committing to the kind of systematic, well-resourced expedition that might actually make significant discoveries. And for those who pushed past the fear and went in anyway, the dedicated treasure hunters, the experienced prospectors, the men like Herman Petrash, who had spent decades building the knowledge and confidence to penetrate the mountain's most dangerous zones, there were other mechanisms of discouragement available. The lights that people have reported seeing in the Superstition Mountains for well over a century are among the most consistent elements of the range's supernatural folklore. Glowing orbs, drifting luminescences, columns of pale light rising from the canyon floors, dancing points of radiance on the slopes above the tree line. They have been reported by Apache witnesses before European contact, by Spanish missionaries, by American settlers, by modern hikers with cameras and cell phones. They are among the most reliably observed and completely unexplained features of the superstition landscape. The explanations that the supernatural tradition provides, spirit lights, the eyes of the thunder gods, the fire spirits of Apache legend, are picturesque. They are also wrong in their specific attribution, while being entirely correct in their core observation that something real and physically present is generating that light. Uranium ore in sufficient concentration undergoes a process called radioluminescence. The energy released by radioactive decay interacts with surrounding minerals, particularly certain silicate compounds common in volcanic geology, to produce a faint but visible glow under the right conditions. This effect is strongly associated with specific temperature and humidity conditions. It is most visible at night, particularly during periods of temperature transition, and the superstition's dramatic daily temperature swings between scorching desert days and cool nights create precisely the conditions under which radioluminescent effects would be most pronounced. The lights are real. They are the mind's own emissions, visible to anyone patient enough and brave enough to be in the mountains at the right hour, in the right canyon, looking at the right section of exposed rock face. The Apache, observing these lights over generations, correctly identified them as evidence of something powerful and dangerous within the rock. They attributed it to divine agency because that was the most coherent interpretive framework available to them. They were right about the danger. They were right about the power. They were working with the available explanatory tools. Additional light sources have been identified by researchers studying the area in more recent decades. Natural gas vents, associated with the volcanic geology of the range, can produce combustion events at the surface. Brief, flickering lights that appear and disappear without pattern. The ionization effects produced by high radiation environments can interact with atmospheric moisture under certain conditions to produce visible luminescent effects. And in the more recent decades, the presence of federal monitoring equipment in the mountains, equipment that would logically be positioned to track both radiological conditions and human intrusion, has added a technological dimension to the light reports that earlier observers could not have anticipated. The satellite data is, arguably, the most difficult element of the conspiracy framework for skeptics to dismiss, because it does not come from eyewitness testimony, does not depend on the credibility of prospectors, or treasure hunters, or hikers with folklore-inflected imaginations. It comes from instruments. Beginning in the early 2000s, independent researchers with access to commercial satellite imaging data, specifically thermal infrared data, which maps heat emissions from the Earth's surface, began examining the Superstition Mountains with the tools that their era made available. What they found in the thermal data was anomalous. There are heat signatures beneath the surface of the Western superstitions, localized, specific, persistent, that do not match the thermal profile of natural geothermal activity. Geothermal heat signatures are diffuse, they spread, they correlate with known geological features, active fault lines, magmatic intrusions, hydrothermal systems. The signatures in the superstitions are too small, too localized, too specifically shaped to be natural geothermal phenomena. They are consistent in terms of size and thermal intensity and localization pattern, with sealed underground spaces, chambers, tunnels, shafts that contain material generating thermal energy through ongoing radioactive decay. They are, in other words, consistent with what a sealed uranium storage vault would look like from space, or a uranium mine that had never actually been abandoned, but had instead been converted to controlled extraction under federal management, or a Cold War-era geological disposal site, sequestering radioactive waste in the kind of deep, stable, geologically isolated formation that the relevant agencies were actively identifying and developing throughout the 1950s, 60s and 70s for exactly that purpose. The search and rescue data tells its own quiet story, if you know how to read it. The Maricopa County Sheriff's Office maintains records of wilderness search and rescue operations in the Superstition Wilderness going back to the 1970s. Those records, publicly accessible with appropriate requests, show a consistent pattern that began shifting in the mid-2000s in ways that are statistically notable. The total number of search and rescue operations in the Superstitions has increased over this period, which is not surprising. The general population has grown, outdoor recreation has increased in popularity, and improved communication technology means that distress calls that would previously have gone unreported now generate official responses. What is more interesting is the subset of those operations that involve prospectors and mineral hunters specifically, and more specifically still, the subset of those operations in which recovery teams report finding specialized equipment, radiation detection devices, ore sample containers, mineral analysis tools, that then disappears from the official evidence record before documentation is completed. This is not a single incident. It is not 2 or 3 anomalous cases that might be attributed to administrative error or miscommunication. Researchers who have systematically cross-referenced initial search and rescue reports with final case documentation, comparing what was logged at the scene against what appears in the official file, have identified a consistent pattern of specific equipment types vanishing from the evidence chain. The equipment that disappears is, without exception, the equipment that would be most useful for detecting, identifying and documenting radioactive materials. Standard camping gear, tents, sleeping bags, cooking equipment, personal effects remains in the record. Detection equipment, sample containers, geological analysis tools, gone. Transferred typically to a federal agency through a documentation process that consistently involves partial redaction of the receiving agency's identity. The DOE memo that has circulated among researchers focusing on this topic since approximately 2010, its provenance uncertain, its authentication disputed, but its contents internally consistent with what is known about relevant federal programs, describes, if it is genuine, a Cold War-era decision to convert the primary ore deposits discovered beneath the Superstitions into a controlled federal mineral operation. The memo, which describes the facility in operational terms rather than planning terms, suggests that extraction began in the early 1960s, that the primary access tunnels were constructed to government engineering specifications beneath the existing natural mine system, that the gold vein that Waltz and the Peraltas and every subsequent treasure hunter has been seeking does indeed exist, and that it runs through host rock of such high uranium content that any private extraction operation would represent an immediate and severe public health catastrophe. Gold and uranium occur together in the geological record more frequently than most people understand. The same geological processes that concentrate gold in primary vein deposits, hydrothermal fluid flow through fractured rock, precipitation of minerals from superheated water as it cools within the Earth's crust, also concentrate uranium. The two metals are geochemically frequent companions. A gold deposit rich enough to be commercially attractive and containing the kind of purity grades that Jacob Waltz's ore consistently showed is, in certain geological contexts, almost inevitably accompanied by significant uranium mineralization in the host rock. Waltz's mine was not unusual in this respect. What was unusual was the concentration. The specific combination of volcanic geology, hydrothermal history, and deep primary formation that the Superstitions represent appears to have produced a uranium-bearing gold deposit of exceptional richness. Exceptional enough that the gold, in the federal calculus, was essentially incidental. The uranium was the prize. The uranium was the national security asset. The gold was just what the legend was about. The memo describes the facility as serving multiple functions across its operational history. Uranium ore extraction in the 1960s and early 70s, transitioning to a geological storage function for processed radioactive material as the extraction operation wound down, and subsequently serving as what the document calls an emergency mineral reserve facility. Language that carries implications that the document does not make explicit, but that students of Cold War-era federal nuclear planning will recognise as a reference to stockpile storage. The Atomic Energy Commission's successor agencies maintained a network of such facilities, many of them in remote western geological formations chosen precisely for their stability, their isolation, and their lack of significant civilian proximity. The superstitions, if the memo is genuine, were not simply convenient for this purpose, they were ideal. The existing legend provided a natural access deterrent that no fence or signage could replicate. The landscape's genuine physical dangers supplemented the psychological barrier of the folklore, and the federal land designations provided legal authority to remove, without public explanation, anyone who managed to penetrate deep enough to find what they were not supposed to find. Gerald Ashmore's Geiger counter, the one that the rangers photographed in the parking area before the photographs disappeared from the official record, contained stored readings from his final expedition. The note he had taped to the casing, "The radiation spikes at sunset. Do not stay after dark," was not the notation of a man who had found a natural low-level background radiation zone of the kind that can be found in many parts of the American Southwest. Natural uranium deposits produce background radiation levels measurable in microsieverts per hour. Detectable, quantifiable, interesting from a geological standpoint, but not the kind of thing that generates urgent written warnings about temporal exposure windows. The kind of radiation that spikes at sunset, that creates a meaningful enough differential between daytime and nighttime readings to become a behavioural concern, is a different order of magnitude. It suggests a source that is cycling, an underground system that responds to temperature changes, to pressure differentials, to the geological shifts that come with the dramatic diurnal temperature swings of the Sonoran Desert. It suggests something that is not simply sitting passively in the rock, but doing something, producing something, operating. The drone footage that a group of independent researchers obtained in 2022, flying a commercial quadcopter through a previously unexamined drainage in the Western Superstitions, shows something that defies any conventional geological explanation. At the base of a sheer canyon wall, partially obscured by a rockfall that appears relatively recent, decades old rather than centuries, based on the weathering pattern, there is a structure. It is not natural stone formation. Its surfaces are too regular, too angular, too precisely oriented relative to the canyon wall. What appears to be a sealed entry, a door, or a blocked tunnel mouth, or a deliberately concealed access point of some kind, is visible in the footage for approximately 14 seconds before the drone's battery, already at 21% capacity when the footage begins, drops below the threshold required to maintain stable flight, and the operator pulls it back. The research team spent 3 months trying to return to the site, organise a ground-level expedition, and access the location on foot. On 2 occasions they were turned back by federal law enforcement, operating under Wilderness Preservation Authority. On the 3rd, the relevant section of the drainage was closed for what was described as a geological hazard evaluation that has, as of this writing, not been reopened to public access. On the surface of what appears to be the entry structure, partially obscured by lichen growth and the mineral staining that decades of water flow down the canyon wall would produce, there is a marking. The drone footage is not high enough resolution to read it clearly, and the angle is not ideal, but photographic enhancement applied by researchers with professional imaging tools produces something consistent with a circular emblem, the kind of official government seal that federal agencies applied to their installations throughout the mid-20th century. The specific agency whose seal the researchers believe the emblem most closely resembles, based on the visible structural elements that survive the resolution limitation and the lichen coverage, is the United States Atomic Energy Commission, the predecessor organisation to the Department of Energy, the agency that was responsible for the nation's nuclear weapons program and civilian nuclear activities from 1946 until its dissolution in 1974. The Atomic Energy Commission no longer exists as an institutional entity. Its successor agencies, the Nuclear Regulatory Commission and the Department of Energy, inherited its files, its facilities, and its obligations. They also inherited, presumably, the records of whatever the AEC built in the Superstition Mountains during the decades of its operation. Those records, if they exist in the form that the conspiracy framework suggests, would be among the most comprehensively classified documents in the Federal Archive, not because of any particular operational sensitivity in the present day, but because of the chain of events that would be implied by their disclosure. If the federal government identified a major uranium deposit in the Superstitions, converted it to a military-adjacent facility, and simultaneously allowed, or actively cultivated, a legend of supernatural curse to serve as a civilian access deterrent, the human cost of that decision is measured in lives, in every prospector who entered those mountains and died of exposure that was not simple dehydration, in every treasure hunter who came back from an expedition with symptoms they could not explain and that their doctors could not diagnose, in every man like Gerald Ashmore who got close enough to find the spike in the readings, wrote a warning note about what he had found, and then disappeared into a canyon that experienced search teams could not, or would not, adequately cover. The curse of the Superstition Mountains is not supernatural. It has never been supernatural. The thunder gods that the Apache warned about were real forces producing real effects. Ionizing radiation, magnetic field disruption, toxic gas emissions from geological venting, the physiological cascade of radiation sickness presenting in men who had no framework for understanding what was happening to their bodies. The legend that grew up around Jacob Waltz's gold was not invented to deceive. It was organic, emerging from genuine experiences of real danger that no one in the 19th century had the scientific vocabulary to accurately describe. But at some point in the middle of the 20th century, when the relevant agencies finally did have the scientific vocabulary, when they finally understood exactly what was in those mountains and exactly what it was doing to the people who entered them, the choice was made to not correct the record, to not warn the public, to allow the legend of supernatural curse to do the work of factual warning, because factual warning would have required explanation, and explanation would have required disclosure, and disclosure was never going to happen. The prospectors who died in the Superstition Mountains were not unlucky in the way that the legend suggests, not cursed by some mystical force that punishes gold-seeking with death, not victims of jealous ghosts or divine retribution for the sin of greed. They were workers, in a sense, in an economy of risk that they did not fully understand, in a landscape that they had not been given the information they needed to navigate safely. They were citizens in a country that had decided their lives were worth less than the operational security of a classified mineral facility. They were people who deserved to know what was in the rock and were never told. The Superstition Mountains still rise from the desert east of Phoenix, still catch the late afternoon light in shades of rust and gold and deep volcanic black, still cast their long shadows across the valley below. The wilderness designation still stands. The access restrictions are still in place. The search and rescue operations still happen, still generate their initial reports and their final reports, still accumulate their patterns of equipment that vanishes from the evidence chain in specific and suggestive ways. The legend still draws people in. Thousands of visitors every year, hundreds of serious prospectors, dozens of committed treasure hunters who have spent years or decades building their maps and their theories and their conviction that the Lost Dutchman mine is findable, that with the right information and the right approach it is possible to find what Jacob Waltz found and survive the finding of it. Some of them, presumably, will get close enough to notice what Gerald Ashmore noticed, close enough to see the readings change in ways that don't fit the natural background, close enough to find a canyon where the compass spins and the rock walls feel warm and there is a taste in the air that no water source or food could account for, close enough to see, in the right drainage at the right hour, a light that comes from somewhere beneath the stone. They will reach for their notebooks and their cameras and their field instruments, and they will record what they find with the meticulous care of people who know they have found something important. And then the mountains will decide what happens next. The gold is there. It has always been there. It runs through the host rock in veins of exceptional purity, just as Jacob Waltz said, just as the Peralta family found, just as every subsequent generation of prospectors has sensed and followed and died trying to reach. The curse is real. It is made of uranium and radon gas and ionizing radiation, and the long, slow, invisible destruction of the human body by forces that the human eye cannot see and the human nervous system cannot detect until it is already too late to matter. The legend was not a lie. It was a translation, imperfect, culturally filtered, metaphorically dressed, of something that was always physically true. The thunder gods live in the mountains. They are patient. They are invisible. They do not forgive. And somewhere in a federal archive or in a filing system maintained by an agency, whose name may or may not appear on any public organisational chart, in a record group that may or may not be indexed in any publicly accessible catalogue, there is a document that explains all of this in the flat bureaucratic language of a mid-century government memorandum. It describes the facility. It describes its purpose. It describes the decision, made by people whose names may also appear in other, more celebrated chapters of American history, to let the legend do the work, to let the mountains keep their secret, to let the curse stand in for the truth, because the truth was something that the American public was never supposed to know. It is possible that document will never be declassified. It is possible that the people who made the decision never wrote it down in the first place, understanding even then that certain things are safer when they exist only in the minds of those responsible for them. It is possible that the sealed door at the base of the canyon wall, the one partially visible in 14 seconds of drone footage before the battery died, leads to nothing more significant than a long-abandoned prospecting tunnel, sealed for structural safety reasons. It is possible that the thermal anomalies in the satellite data have a perfectly ordinary geological explanation that the researchers who identified them simply lack the expertise to recognise. It is possible that every prospector who died in those mountains died of exactly what the official records say they died of. It is possible that the pattern of equipment disappearing from evidence chains is a coincidence produced by bureaucratic inconsistency rather than deliberate removal. All of this is possible. But Gerald Ashmore taped a note to his Geiger counter. He wrote it in the mountains, in the hours before he disappeared, in a location close enough to his entry point that experienced searchers should have found him within days. The note said that the radiation spikes at sunset. He had been measuring it. He knew what the readings meant. He had come to the Superstition Mountains not as a treasure hunter chasing legend, but as a man who had done his research and formed a specific hypothesis about what was in those mountains, and what those mountains had been keeping from the world. He had the instruments to test his hypothesis. He got close enough to the answer to write a warning, and then he died in a ravine that nobody can quite explain why nobody found sooner. The mountains took Gerald Ashmore the same way they took Jacob Waltz and Adolph Ruth and Herman Petrasch and the Peralta family and every other soul who wandered too far into the wrong canyon at the wrong time looking for the wrong thing, not the gold. The gold was never the wrong thing to look for. The wrong thing to look for was the truth behind the gold, the thing that the gold was sitting on top of, the thing that made the gold secondary and incidental and, in the final accounting, almost beside the point. The Superstition Mountains keep their secrets the way the earth keeps its heat. Not actively, not maliciously, not through any supernatural agency, but simply through the patient operation of physical law. The rock is what it is. The ore is what it is. The radiation is real, and the effects are real, and the dead are real, and none of them had to die the way they died if the people who knew the truth had chosen, at any point along the way, to say it out loud. They did not make that choice. They made a different one. And the mountains, unbothered and unmoved and entirely indifferent to the moral weight of that decision, rose from the desert the next morning in the same volcanic silhouette they have always presented, caught the first light of the sun on their rust-coloured faces, and went on keeping what they know. Before we begin, if you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you could possibly know. If you're listening on Spotify, leaving a review helps out so much as well. Also, feel free to comment what time it is for you and where in the world you're listening from, but only if you want to. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. And of course, if you enjoy the content, subscribing really helps us keep bringing you these stories. Now let's get into tonight's investigation. A huge thank you to Justin for suggesting this topic. This one's fascinating, and honestly, it might be one of the most important stories we've ever covered. Imagine being the most decorated soldier in your nation's history. You've bled for your country on 4 different continents, led men through hell, earned the highest honours your military can bestow not once but twice. Now imagine that the wealthiest men in America approach you in secret with a proposal that would change everything. They want you to lead 500,000 armed veterans in a march on the nation's capital. They want you to force the president into submission. They want you to install yourself as a military dictator backed by the largest corporations in the country. This isn't fiction. This isn't speculation. This is the sworn testimony of a man who had no reason to lie and everything to lose by speaking. The year was 1934, and America came within a conversation of becoming a fascist state. The men who planned it walked free. Their names were largely protected, and the story was buried so thoroughly that most Americans have never heard of it. Until now. Prologue. The most decorated Marine speaks out. November 20th, 1934. Washington. The halls of Congress rarely deal in sensational claims. Procedures, budgets, debates over policy. These are the standard fare. Senators and representatives have heard wild accusations before. Conspiracy theories, political grandstanding, attention-seeking witnesses looking for their moment in the spotlight. The committees have learned to filter noise from signal. So when a retired Major General requests to give testimony about an attempted overthrow of the government, the initial response is skepticism. Another crank with delusions of importance. Another veteran unable to adjust to civilian life, seeing conspiracies in every shadow. Then someone looks at the name on the testimony request. Smedley Darlington Butler. The room changes. Suddenly this is not a routine hearing. Butler does not arrive with bodyguards, though given what he's about to say, perhaps he should. He does not bring lawyers or prepared statements crafted by political handlers. He does not have a book to sell or a political career to launch. He walks in alone, a man in his 50s with the bearing of someone who has spent his entire adult life in service to his country. The committee members know who Butler is. Every military officer in America knows who Butler is. He has earned the Medal of Honor twice. Only a handful of men in American history can make that claim. He has fought in China, Nicaragua, Haiti, and the trenches of World War I. He has commanded thousands of men in combat. He has been offered promotions to the highest ranks and turned them down because he disagreed with the politics behind them. Presidents have shaken his hand, and now he's about to tell Congress that some of the wealthiest and most powerful men in America tried to recruit him to lead a military coup. The committee chairman, Representative John McCormack, calls the hearing to order. Butler is sworn in. His voice is steady as he begins to speak. Not angry, not fearful, simply factual, the way a military officer delivers a situation report. He provides names. Gerald McGuire, a bond salesman with connections to Wall Street. Specific dates, summer of 1933. Multiple meetings at his home in Pennsylvania. He describes conversations that began innocuously, about veteran organizations and political influence, that gradually escalated into something far more sinister. Butler tells them about trips Maguire made to Europe, studying how Mussolini organised his fascist state in Italy, how Hitler was consolidating power in Germany. He describes plans to recruit 500,000 veterans, men who trusted him, men who had followed him into battle, men who would follow him one more time. But this time, the battle would not be against a foreign enemy. This time, the battle would be for control of America itself. The plan, as Butler describes it, was sophisticated. Not a violent overthrow, not tanks in the streets, something more subtle. A massive peaceful march on Washington, that would nevertheless carry the implicit threat of overwhelming military force. The imagery alone would be powerful. 500,000 trained soldiers, many of them desperate and angry about the Depression, united behind the most famous general in America. And what would they demand? According to Maguire's alleged pitch, they would force President Franklin Roosevelt to appoint a Secretary of General Affairs, a new position that would effectively run the government. Roosevelt would remain as president in name, a figurehead for public consumption. But real power would shift to this new office, and who would hold this position? Butler himself. The committee members lean forward. This is not the rambling of a disturbed mind. This is specific. This is detailed. This is, if true, an actual attempted coup. Butler does not speculate about motives. He does not editorialize. He simply lays out the facts as he experienced them. Who contacted him, what they said, what they offered, what they planned. He tells them he did not agree. That he continued meeting with Maguire, gathering information, trying to understand the full scope of what was being proposed, and that when he finally understood how serious this was, he knew he had only one option: expose it. Butler does not ask for protection. He does not demand action. He simply presents his testimony and waits for Congress to respond. The committee will investigate. They will interview witnesses. They will examine documents. They will attempt to corroborate Butler's extraordinary claims. And in the end, they will confirm that discussions about removing President Franklin Roosevelt did indeed take place. They will state explicitly that a fascist organisation was planned and might have been executed. But no one will be prosecuted. No major financiers will be subpoenaed. No corporate executives will face charges. And the story will quietly disappear from the headlines, buried beneath other news, forgotten by a public already overwhelmed by economic catastrophe. This is the story of the business plot, the coup that almost was, the conspiracy that involved some of the most powerful men in America, the warning that we ignored, and the question of whether it could happen again. Chapter 1. America on the Brink. To understand why anyone would even consider overthrowing the American government, you have to understand what America looked like in the early 1930s, and more importantly, you have to understand how terrified the wealthy elite were of what was happening. The Great Depression has destroyed the country, not metaphorically, not in an exaggerated sense. It has genuinely devastated the nation in ways that most modern Americans cannot fully comprehend. Unemployment exceeds 25%. That's 1 in 4 working-age Americans without a job. In some cities, the number is closer to 40%. No unemployment insurance exists. No federal safety net, no food stamps or welfare programs. If you lose your job, you lose everything. Your home, your savings, your future. Banks are collapsing at an unprecedented rate. Between 1930 and 1933, over 9,000 banks fail. 9,000. People's life savings vanish overnight. Elderly couples who spent decades building retirement funds find themselves destitute. Small businesses close because they cannot access credit. Farms are foreclosed by the thousands. Hunger is everywhere. Breadlines stretch for blocks in every major city. Children go to school with empty stomachs. Families survive on bread and watered-down soup. Malnutrition rates skyrocket. People are literally starving in the richest country in the world. Shanty towns spring up on the edges of cities, makeshift communities of cardboard and scrap metal that people sarcastically call Hoovervilles after President Herbert Hoover, who many blame for the crisis. Families live in shacks made from packing crates. Children play in dirt streets. Disease spreads, and the government does virtually nothing. In the summer of 1932, something happens that shakes the nation's confidence even further. Thousands of World War I veterans march on Washington demanding early payment of bonuses they were promised for their service. These are not radicals. These are not communists or anarchists. These are soldiers who fought for America, who risked their lives in France, who came home to a country that thanked them with parades and then forgot about them. Now they are desperate. Many are homeless. Their families are hungry. The bonus payments are not due until 1945, but they need help now. They set up camps in Washington, peaceful protests asking their government for assistance. The government's response reveals how deeply the elite fear popular movements. President Hoover orders the military to clear the camps. General Douglas MacArthur, who will play his own role in conspiracy theories throughout his career, leads the operation. Tanks roll through the streets of Washington. Soldiers use tear gas on veterans. Cavalry charges disperse crowds. The camps are burned. Men who fought for their country are treated like enemy combatants. This event is critical to understanding the business plot. It proves that the military will fire on American citizens if ordered. It demonstrates that when the establishment feels threatened, it responds with force, and it creates a deep reservoir of anger among veterans that men like Butler could potentially tap into. This is the America that Franklin Delano Roosevelt inherits when he takes office in March 1933. Roosevelt moves fast. Within his first 100 days, he launches the New Deal, a sweeping series of programs designed to pull America out of the Depression. Federal spending increases dramatically. New agencies are created: the Civilian Conservation Corps, the Works Progress Administration, the Social Security Administration. Banking regulations are imposed through the Glass-Steagall Act. Labour unions gain protection through the National Industrial Recovery Act. The government expands its role in the economy in ways that would have been unthinkable just years before. For millions of suffering Americans, Roosevelt is a saviour. His fireside chats on the radio provide hope. His programs provide jobs. His rhetoric provides dignity to the unemployed and dispossessed. For the wealthy elite, however, Roosevelt is something far more dangerous. He is a traitor to his class. Roosevelt comes from old money. His family is part of the American aristocracy. He attended the best schools. He married into the right circles. By all rights, he should be defending the interests of his class against the demands of the masses. Instead, he is siding with the masses against his own class. Corporate executives watch in horror as their power is curtailed. Banking elites see their freedom to operate without oversight disappear. Industrialists face new regulations and union protections that threaten profit margins. These men have spent decades building empires with minimal government interference, and now a president is telling them that the rules have changed, that workers have rights, that the government can regulate business, that profit cannot be the only consideration. To many wealthy Americans, this is not reform. This is socialism. This is the first step toward communism. This is the end of everything they have built. Some of them begin to look elsewhere for solutions. Across the Atlantic Ocean, a different kind of government is rising. In Italy, Benito Mussolini has created a fascist state that promises order, discipline, and most importantly for business interests, the complete suppression of labour movements and socialist organising. Strikes are illegal. Unions are controlled by the state. Workers are disciplined. Trains run on time, and corporate profits are protected by military force. In Germany, Adolf Hitler is consolidating power through a similar model. He crushes the Communist Party, destroys independent unions, and creates a system where business and government work hand in hand, as long as business understands who is really in charge. And some American elites are watching, not with horror, with interest, with a growing sense that perhaps this model could work in America. These European governments don't have labour strikes. They don't have socialist movements threatening to redistribute wealth. They don't have presidents who side with workers over owners. They have strong leaders who keep business running smoothly, who suppress dissent efficiently, who promise stability even at the cost of freedom. If it can work there, some begin to wonder, why not here? The ground is fertile for something unprecedented in American history. The economy is shattered. Trust in government is eroding. Millions of veterans trained in combat and accustomed to following orders are unemployed and angry. And the president is implementing policies that threaten the very foundation of corporate power. All it would take is the right leader. Someone with credibility among veterans. Someone who could be presented as saving America rather than destroying it. Someone who veterans would follow without question. Someone exactly like Smedley Butler. The question was not whether someone would try. The question was when and how carefully they would plan it. Chapter 2. Who was Smedley Butler? Smedley Darlington Butler was born in 1881 in Westchester, Pennsylvania. His father, Thomas Butler, was a lawyer who would eventually serve in the US House of Representatives for over 30 years. His mother came from a prominent Quaker family, people of peace who nevertheless understood duty and service. The family was respectable, educated, politically connected. Young Smedley could have chosen any number of comfortable careers: law, politics, business. A life of ease and influence awaited him. Instead, at age 16, he lied about his age and enlisted in the Marine Corps during the Spanish-American War. This decision would define everything that followed. Butler's military career reads like something out of an adventure novel, except every word is documented military history. He serves in Honduras, Nicaragua, Panama, Mexico, Haiti, and China. He fights in the Boxer Rebellion, where foreign powers carve up China like a pie, and Butler sees firsthand how military force serves economic interests. He participates in the occupation of Veracruz during the Mexican Revolution. He helps suppress rebellions in Haiti, an occupation that will later haunt his conscience. He earns the Medal of Honor not once, but twice. The first comes in 1914 during the Veracruz incident. The second comes in 1915 in Haiti. He is one of only 19 men in American history to receive this distinction twice. Even among this elite group, Butler stands out for the sheer number of combat situations he survives. Stories about Butler become legend among Marines. Once, while fighting in Haiti against rebel forces, he personally led his men in an assault on a fortress built into a mountain. The approach was up a sheer cliff face under heavy fire. Butler climbed ahead of his troops, drawing fire, refusing to order men into danger he wouldn't face himself. When they took the fortress, Butler's uniform was torn and burned from bullets that nearly killed him. Another time, during an operation in China, Butler learned that a railway was being used to transport rebel reinforcements. Rather than engage in a prolonged battle, he simply had his men tear up several miles of track overnight. The reinforcements never arrived. The rebellion collapsed without a major fight. But Butler is more than just brave. He is genuinely concerned about his men in a way that is unusual for officers of his era. He fights constantly for better conditions, better equipment, better pay. He personally inspects food supplies and medical facilities. He writes letters to the families of men killed under his command. Marines under his command know that their general will not waste their lives unnecessarily, and that he will be right there with them when danger comes. By the 1920s, Butler is one of the most famous military figures in America. He is appointed Director of Public Safety in Philadelphia, where he attempts to clean up rampant corruption in the police department. He makes enemies among political bosses and organised crime figures by actually enforcing laws. After 2 years, the pressure becomes too great and he returns to military service. He gives speeches across the country. Veterans admire him. The public knows his name. He's offered promotions to the highest ranks of the Marine Corps, but turns them down when he disagrees with the politics behind them. Then something changes in Butler's perspective. As he looks back at his decades of service, he begins to see patterns that disturb him profoundly. He realizes that many of the military operations he participated in were not about defending America. They were about defending American corporate interests abroad. He helped suppress revolutions that threatened American companies. He protected banana plantations in Central America. He secured mining rights in Haiti. He ensured that American banks could collect debts from foreign governments. He begins speaking out about this. Not quietly, not tactfully, loudly and publicly. In 1935, he'll publish a short book called War is a Racket. In it, he'll write something that shocks many Americans. I spent 33 years and 4 months in active military service, and during that period I spent most of my time as a high-class muscle man for big business, for Wall Street and the bankers. In short, I was a racketeer, a gangster for capitalism. I helped make Mexico, especially Tampico, safe for American oil interests. I helped make Haiti and Cuba a decent place for the National City Bank boys to collect revenues in. I helped in the raping of 6 Central American republics for the benefit of Wall Street. The record of racketeering is long. This is not a minor figure making wild claims. This is one of the most decorated officers in American military history, explicitly stating that he was used as an enforcer for corporate interests. But in 1933, when the approach comes, Butler is still a respected figure who has not yet fully articulated these ideas. He has retired from active duty but remains deeply connected to veteran communities. He gives speeches criticising corporate influence and war profiteering, but he is not considered radical or dangerous. He is simply a general speaking uncomfortable truths that most people choose to ignore. This makes him perfect for what comes next. He is famous enough to command instant loyalty from veterans across the country. He is critical enough of the establishment to seem like he might be sympathetic to dramatic change. He has demonstrated willingness to stand up to authority when he believes it is corrupt. But he is not so radical that approaching him would be obviously insane. Whoever decided to recruit Butler understood these factors carefully. They had done their research. They knew his background, his beliefs, his influence. They chose well. What they did not anticipate, what they could not have known, was that Butler's criticism of corporate power was not a performance. It was not positioning for future political office. It was not rhetorical flourish for applause at veteran gatherings. It was genuine conviction, born from decades of experience, from seeing how power really operates, from recognising his own role in a system he had come to despise. And when they approached him with their proposal, they would learn exactly how deep that conviction ran. They would learn that Smedley Butler could not be bought, could not be flattered into compliance, could not be convinced that overthrowing democracy was patriotic. They chose the right man for their purposes. They just chose the wrong man to trust. Chapter 3. The Approach. The first contact comes in the summer of 1933, just months after Roosevelt takes office and begins implementing the New Deal. Gerald Curly Maguire is a bond salesman working for Grayson M.P. Murphy and Company, a prestigious Wall Street brokerage firm. On the surface, there is nothing particularly remarkable about Maguire. He is 43 years old, well-dressed, well-spoken, the type of man who can move comfortably in rooms full of money and power without being the centre of attention. He is connected to the American Legion, one of the largest veteran organisations in the country, serving as commander of a Connecticut post. He moves in circles of wealth and influence, but is not himself a major figure. He is what intelligence operatives would call a cutout, someone who makes contact without revealing who is really behind the operation. Maguire approaches Butler with what seems, initially, like a modest and reasonable proposal. He wants Butler's help in influencing the American Legion's annual convention. The Legion is considering resolutions about monetary policy, specifically about whether America should return to the gold standard. This is not an obscure economic debate. The gold standard question represents a fundamental divide between different economic interests. Banks and wealthy bondholders favour gold because it protects their holdings from inflation. Workers and farmers oppose it because it makes debt harder to pay off and restricts government's ability to stimulate the economy. Maguire claims that he represents a group of wealthy Legion members who want to ensure the convention votes the right way. He offers Butler money to attend the convention and use his influence. It is presented as simple political organising, the kind of thing that happens all the time. Butler listens but is non-committal. Something about Maguire does not sit right with him. The offer seems reasonable on its face, but Butler has spent too many years around men with hidden agendas to take anything at face value. He senses something beneath the surface of this request, but cannot quite identify it. Maguire persists. Over the following months, he makes multiple visits to Butler's home in Newtown Square, Pennsylvania. Each time, he brings more information. Each time, the conversation evolves and deepens. What begins as discussions about the American Legion gradually transforms into something far more ambitious and far more dangerous. According to Butler's later testimony, Maguire begins describing trips to Europe. He claims to have travelled extensively, studying how different governments operate. He talks about Italy, where Mussolini has created a system that efficiently combines corporate interest with authoritarian control. He speaks admiringly of how Mussolini dealt with labour problems. He simply made strikes illegal and arrested union organisers. How Mussolini dealt with political opposition. he outlawed other parties and imprisoned dissidents, how Mussolini maintains order through paramilitary groups that enforce discipline with violence when necessary. Maguire is not critical of these methods. He presents them as solutions. Then Maguire starts talking about veterans, about how many former soldiers are unemployed and desperate, about how they feel betrayed by a government that sent them to war and then abandoned them during the Depression, about how they could be organised, mobilised, given purpose and direction again. 500,000 men, he suggests, maybe more, all veterans, all trained in military tactics, all potentially loyal to a leader they respect. The conversations become more explicit over time. Maguire describes a plan that has clearly been developed in detail, not improvised during their meetings. A march on Washington, he explains. Not violent, he insists repeatedly. Peaceful, but overwhelming. 500,000 veterans descending on the Capitol in a show of force that cannot be ignored. The imagery alone would be powerful. The implicit threat of what 500,000 trained soldiers could do if pushed would be even more powerful. And what would they demand? According to Butler's testimony, the goal is to force Roosevelt aside. Not necessarily to remove him entirely, Maguire emphasises, as if this distinction makes the plan less treasonous. The president would remain as a figurehead, someone to give speeches and attend ceremonies, but real power would shift to a new position, Secretary of General Affairs, a person who would effectively run the government, make the actual decisions, control policy, while Roosevelt remains as a symbolic leader for public consumption. And who would be this Secretary of General Affairs? Maguire suggests that Butler himself would be the ideal candidate. Who better than the most decorated Marine in American history? Who better than someone veterans trust implicitly? Who better than a general with no political ambitions, no partisan affiliations, simply a patriot trying to save his country from Roosevelt's dangerous socialist experiment? Butler does not immediately refuse. This is important to understand. He does not throw Maguire out of his house. He does not call the police or report him to authorities. Instead, he continues to listen, asking questions, probing deeper. He wants to understand exactly who is behind this and how serious they are. He wants to know if this is one delusional bond salesman with fantasies of importance, or if this represents something much larger and much more dangerous. Maguire provides reassurance on both counts. He mentions backers, wealthy men, men with resources, men who understand that Roosevelt is destroying America and that drastic measures may be necessary. He never provides a complete list of names, but the implications are clear. This is not some fringe conspiracy. This involves people with real power and real money, people who can provide the funding necessary to organise such a massive movement. Butler asks specific questions. What about weapons? Maguire assures him that would not be a problem. Equipment can be acquired. Connections exist to military suppliers. Some veterans still have their service weapons. More can be obtained. Butler asks about public support. Maguire insists that millions of Americans are ready for change, that the New Deal is destroying individual liberty, that strong leadership is necessary to prevent complete economic collapse or communist revolution. He frames the coup not as overthrowing America, but as saving it. Butler asks about the military. What happens when regular army units are ordered to stop 500,000 veterans? Maguire seems confident this will not be a problem. Many officers, he suggests, are themselves unhappy with Roosevelt. The military may not interfere, and if they do, the presence of so many veterans makes violent suppression politically impossible. But Butler is not convinced. Or rather, he is convinced that something serious is being planned. But he is not convinced that it is right. He is not convinced that replacing democracy with dictatorship, even a supposedly benevolent one, is acceptable. He's not convinced that men who wear nice suits and speak about patriotism are actually patriots rather than oligarchs protecting their wealth. He continues meeting with Maguire throughout late 1933 and into early 1934, gathering information, learning more about the conspiracy. And all the while, a decision is forming in his mind about what he will do with this information. Maguire has no idea that every conversation is being remembered, every detail filed away, every name and connection noted. He believes he is successfully recruiting Butler. He believes the general's questions indicate interest rather than investigation. He is wrong. Butler is gathering evidence, building a case, preparing to do the one thing that will stop this plot before it can truly begin. He is preparing to expose it all. Chapter 4. Following the Money. If Gerald McGuire was simply a rogue bond salesman with delusions of grandeur and no real backing, Butler's story would be interesting but ultimately insignificant. A strange historical footnote about one man's fantasy taken too seriously. What makes the business plot compelling, what makes it genuinely disturbing, is the evidence that McGuire had access to substantial resources and connections to some of the most powerful interests in America. Let's follow the money. McGuire works for Grayson MP Murphy & Company, a Wall Street brokerage firm with deep connections to America's financial elite. Grayson Murphy himself is not just a businessman. He's a director of Guarantee Trust Company, which has close ties to J.P. Morgan. He's a director of Bethlehem Steel, one of the largest industrial corporations in America. He served as a military officer in World War I, giving him connections to the veteran community. He moves effortlessly between worlds of finance, industry, and military affairs. J.P. Morgan Jr., son of the legendary financier, runs one of the most powerful banking institutions in the world. The Morgan interests control or influence dozens of major corporations, railroads, utilities, and financial institutions. When Roosevelt implements banking reforms, when he pushes for greater regulation, when he supports higher taxes on the wealthy, the Morgan interests are among those most directly threatened. But the connections go deeper and become even more intriguing. In August 1934, just months before Butler testifies to Congress, a new organization forms called the American Liberty League. Its stated purpose is to oppose the New Deal and advocate for free enterprise and limited government. This sounds innocuous, like any number of political advocacy groups, but look at who funds it. The DuPont family contributes heavily. Pierre DuPont, Irénée DuPont, and Lambert DuPont are all involved. The DuPonts control DuPont Chemical, one of the largest corporations in America. They also control General Motors through extensive stock holdings. John Jacob Raskob joins as a major supporter. Raskob is a former chairman of General Motors and a former chairman of the Democratic National Committee, a man with connections spanning business and politics. Alfred Sloan, president of General Motors, becomes involved. Andrew Mellon, one of the wealthiest men in America and former Secretary of the Treasury, lends his name. Executives from Standard Oil, Goodyear Tire, and dozens of other major corporations join. These are not fringe figures. These are not minor businessmen angry about taxes. These are titans of American industry who collectively control a substantial portion of the American economy. The American Liberty League operates openly, publishing materials opposing the New Deal, lobbying against specific policies, giving speeches about the dangers of expanding government power. This is legal. This is protected speech. There is nothing inherently sinister about wealthy people advocating for their economic interests through legitimate political channels. But historians note the timing. The Liberty League forms right around the time Butler goes public with his allegations about a fascist plot. Its membership includes exactly the kind of corporate interests who would have been most threatened by Roosevelt's policies, and its rhetoric often echoes the themes McGuire allegedly discussed with Butler: that Roosevelt is destroying American freedom, that strong action may be necessary to save the country, that business interests must organize to protect themselves. Was the Liberty League connected to the plot Butler described? No direct evidence proves this, but the overlap is impossible to ignore. Butler's testimony includes other details that suggest serious backing beyond McGuire's personal resources. McGuire claimed to have travelled to Europe specifically to study fascist governments and how they organise paramilitary movements. Such a trip would require substantial funding and clear purpose. Business travellers don't casually spend months touring Italy and Germany studying political systems. Congressional investigators later confirmed that McGuire did indeed make these European trips. This is documented fact, not speculation. So he had access to money for extended international travel during the Depression, when most Americans could barely afford food. Maguire allegedly spoke to Butler about access to weapons and equipment for equipping hundreds of thousands of veterans. Either this was complete fabrication, or he had connections to military suppliers and confidence that funding would be available. He discussed specific plans for organising veteran groups, strategies for recruitment, logistics for moving masses of people to Washington. This level of detail suggests either serious planning or an impressively elaborate fantasy. The congressional committee that later investigated found Maguire's story partially corroborated. They confirmed he had made trips to Europe. They confirmed conversations between Maguire and Butler took place exactly as Butler described. They found evidence of discussions about organising veterans for political purposes. What they did not find, or at least did not make public, was direct documentation of funding sources or explicit approval from major corporate figures. No paper trail connected specific wealthy individuals to the plot. No document surfaced showing corporate board meetings where overthrowing the government was discussed. This is where the conspiracy deepens rather than dissolves, because the absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence, especially when dealing with sophisticated people who understand how to insulate themselves from risk. Powerful people do not write memos about treason. They do not create paper trails connecting them to coup attempts. They use intermediaries, cutouts, people like Maguire who can make contact without revealing who is really behind the operation. If the plot succeeds, the real backers reveal themselves and reap the rewards. If it fails, the intermediary takes the fall while the masterminds remain untouchable. This is basic tradecraft for anyone engaged in illegal or politically dangerous activities. So the question is not whether there is explicit documentation connecting wealthy elites to the business plot. The question is whether the circumstantial evidence is strong enough to suggest their involvement, despite the lack of explicit proof. Gerald Maguire had European travel funding during the Depression. He had access to people with resources. He spoke confidently about acquiring weapons and equipment. He made specific references to wealthy backers. His employer was connected to the Morgan interests, and an organisation formed by many of the same interests he allegedly represented appeared right as the plot was being exposed. Butler would later say that he believed Maguire was a messenger for far more powerful figures, that the bond salesman was not the architect but merely the recruiter, that if he had agreed to the plan, the real players would have revealed themselves, providing the funding and support necessary to execute the operation. But Butler did not agree, and so the identities of those real players, if they existed beyond Maguire's imagination, remained hidden in the shadows where powerful people prefer to operate. Chapter 5. Congress Investigates. On November 20th, 1934, the Special Committee on Un-American Activities, commonly known as the McCormick-Dickstein Committee, hears extraordinary testimony from Smedley Darlington Butler. The committee is chaired by Representatives John McCormick of Massachusetts and Samuel Dickstein of New York. It was originally formed to investigate Nazi propaganda activities in the United States, part of a growing concern about foreign influence in American politics. The timing is significant. Hitler has consolidated power in Germany. Fascist movements are growing across Europe, and American politicians are beginning to worry that similar ideologies might take root in the United States. Butler's allegations expand their mandate considerably. This is not about foreign propaganda. This is about domestic conspiracy. This is about American citizens, wealthy and powerful American citizens, allegedly plotting to overthrow the American government. The hearing room is not packed with reporters. This is not a public spectacle with cameras and dramatic confrontations. It is a relatively quiet congressional hearing, the kind that happens regularly in Washington, attended by committee members, a few staff members, and minimal press coverage. Butler speaks for hours. His testimony is methodical, detailed, and disturbing. He provides specific dates for his meetings with Maguire. He recounts conversations nearly word for word, the way someone with military training remembers briefings and debriefings. He describes how Maguire's approach evolved over months, from seemingly innocent discussions about veteran politics to explicit plans for marching on Washington and installing a dictator. He names names where he can. Gerald Maguire is identified explicitly. Grayson Murphy is mentioned as Maguire's employer, References are made to connections with Morgan banking interests and major corporations, though Butler is careful not to make accusations he cannot prove. He describes the European trip Maguire took to study fascist organising methods. He recounts Maguire's admiring descriptions of Mussolini's approach to governance. He explains the proposed structure: 500,000 veterans, a massive march, forcing Roosevelt into a figurehead role, installing Butler himself as Secretary of General Affairs. The committee is sceptical at first, as any reasonable people would be. The idea of wealthy American business leaders attempting to overthrow the government seems absurd. America is not some unstable Latin American republic prone to coups. This is the United States, with deep democratic traditions and institutional stability. But Butler's credibility is impeccable. He is not known for wild claims or attention-seeking behaviour. His military record is beyond reproach. He has nothing to gain from fabricating this story and much to lose. If he is lying, he is committing perjury before Congress, destroying his reputation and making himself look like a paranoid fool. And his testimony is specific enough to be verified or disproven. He provides dates, locations, names. If this is fabrication, investigators can prove it. If it is true, evidence will exist to corroborate it. So they investigate. Gerald Maguire is called to testify. He arrives looking nervous, which is understandable given that he has just been accused before Congress of planning treason. He denies Butler's allegations, claiming the general misunderstood their conversations. He admits to meeting with Butler multiple times, which establishes that contact occurred as Butler described. But he insists they discussed only conventional political organising, nothing treasonous, nothing resembling a coup attempt. He acknowledges travelling to Europe but says it was for business purposes unrelated to studying fascist governments. He admits connections to Wall Street and major corporations, but frames these as normal business relationships, not conspiracy. His testimony is careful. He does not directly call Butler a liar, which would be risky given Butler's reputation. Instead, he suggests misunderstanding, misinterpretation, conversations taken out of context. But there are problems with Maguire's denials. Investigators confirm details that corroborate Butler's version. They verify Maguire's European trips occurred when and where Butler said they did. They find evidence that Maguire did indeed have conversations about organising veterans for political purposes. They discover that Maguire had access to funding and connections that go beyond what a simple bond salesman would normally possess. Other witnesses are interviewed. Some corroborate parts of Butler's story. Paul Comley French, a journalist who accompanied Butler to one meeting with Maguire, testifies that Maguire did indeed discuss plans for a veterans' march on Washington. This is crucial. Butler is not the only person who heard these things. An independent witness confirms key elements of the story. The committee examines documents, travel records, financial transactions. They dig into Maguire's background, his connections, his activities in the months leading up to Butler's testimony. What emerges is a complicated picture. Clear evidence exists that Maguire approached Butler. Evidence confirms that Maguire had connections to wealthy interests opposed to Roosevelt. Evidence shows discussions about organising veterans took place. Evidence demonstrates Maguire travelled to Europe and studied fascist governments. But direct proof of a concrete operational plan to overthrow the government remains elusive. No written plans surface. No smoking gun documents appear. No major financiers step forward to admit involvement or testify about what they knew. This is where the investigation reaches its limits. Either the conspirators were sophisticated enough to avoid creating evidence, or the conspiracy was more talk than action. Wealthy men entertaining dangerous fantasies without committing to actual treason. In February 1935, the committee releases its report. The language is carefully worded but extremely significant for anyone who reads closely. In the last few weeks of the committee's official life, it received evidence showing that certain persons had made an attempt to establish a fascist organisation in this country. There is no question that these attempts were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution when and if the financial backers deemed it expedient. Read that carefully. Read it again. The committee confirms that attempts were discussed. They confirm plans existed. They confirm these plans might have been placed in execution if financial backers chose to proceed. This is not a dismissal of Butler's claims as the ravings of a paranoid general. This is not a statement that nothing happened. This is an explicit confirmation that a fascist organisation was planned and could have been executed. Yet the report carefully avoids naming most of the people allegedly involved. References to certain persons and financial backers remain vague. The names of major corporate figures are largely omitted. The full extent of who was involved, how much money was available, how far planning had progressed, all of this remains obscured, and most remarkably, no criminal charges follow. No subpoenas are issued for the major business figures whose names appeared in testimony. No prosecutions occur. The Justice Department takes no action. The investigation simply ends. The committee disbands. The story fades. Why? Several theories exist. Some suggest Roosevelt decided that prosecuting wealthy business leaders during a depression would destabilize the economy further. Others argue that evidence was insufficient for convictions, that without documentation explicitly showing conspiracy to commit treason, criminal charges would fail. Still others believe that powerful interest had enough influence to ensure the matter was quietly buried, that threats were made, pressure was applied, and people with something to lose made sure the investigation went only so far and no further. What is undeniable is that Congress confirmed something serious happened, something that involved planning to establish a fascist organisation, something that might have been executed. And then Congress, the Justice Department, and the Roosevelt administration all decided to let it go. Butler continues speaking publicly about the plot, giving speeches, granting interviews. But media attention dwindles rapidly. He becomes, in many circles, dismissed as someone who perhaps exaggerated a minor incident into a major conspiracy. But the congressional record remains. The testimony is preserved. The committee's conclusion stands, recorded in official documents. Something was planned. Something serious. Something that came closer to happening than most Americans will ever realize. And the people responsible walked free. Chapter 6. The Media Silence. One of the most puzzling and revealing aspects of the business plot is how quickly it disappeared from public consciousness. A decorated general testifies under oath that wealthy interests tried to recruit him for a coup. Congress investigates and confirms that discussions about establishing a fascist organisation took place. Yet within weeks, the story is barely mentioned in major newspapers, and within months, it is almost completely forgotten. This is not how major political scandals normally work. When the Teapot Dome scandal broke in the 1920s, revealing corruption in the Harding administration, newspapers covered it for years. When organised crime figures made headlines, the stories ran for months. When labour disputes turned violent, front-page coverage continued until the situations resolved. But the business plot? After the initial reports when Butler first makes his allegations, coverage drops off dramatically. And the coverage that does exist is often dismissive or sceptical rather than investigative. Initial coverage exists. When Butler first makes his allegations public in November 1934, some newspapers report them. But the tone is revealing. Headlines suggest Butler might be confused or exaggerating. Editorial commentary questions whether a serious plot actually existed. Some papers treat it as a curiosity rather than a potential constitutional crisis. The New York Times, one of the most influential papers in the country, covers the story but treats it with clear skepticism. An early article describes Butler's claims, but focuses more on Maguire's denials than on the details of the alleged conspiracy. The tone implies that a decorated general has perhaps gotten some innocent conversations confused with something more sinister. Other major publications follow similar approaches. The Washington Post, Chicago Tribune, and Los Angeles Times all provide some coverage, but it is measured, cautious, skeptical. Butler's claims are presented as allegations from a controversial figure, rather than credible testimony from a highly decorated officer with no history of fabrication or attention-seeking. Compare this to how other political scandals of the era are covered, especially those involving far less serious allegations. Corruption stories receive extensive ongoing coverage. Political controversies are dissected in detail. Labour disputes and social movements get comprehensive analysis. But a potential coup attempt, that gets a few articles and then silence. When the Congressional Committee releases its findings in February 1935 confirming that planning occurred, you would expect major coverage. Congress has just officially stated that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed and might have been executed. This should be headline news. Instead, the story receives minimal attention. Some papers report the committee's findings briefly. Others do not cover it at all. There is no sustained investigation by major newspapers. No reporters are assigned to dig deeper. No editorial boards demand answers about who was involved and how such planning could occur. The story simply fades. Butler later speaks openly about this media silence. He gives speeches where he explicitly accuses newspapers of suppressing the story. He suggests that powerful interests, the same interests allegedly behind the plot, used their influence to discourage coverage. He points out that many major publications have close ties to the business world through advertising revenue and ownership structures. Stories that implicate wealthy industrialists and bankers might threaten those relationships, and Butler is not wrong about these connections. Major newspapers in the 1930s are owned by wealthy individuals who often have business interests beyond journalism. Advertising revenue comes from corporations who would not appreciate negative coverage. Publishers socialise with the same business leaders who would have been threatened by Roosevelt's policies. There is also the question of what newspapers can prove independently. Butler's testimony is credible, but he is describing private conversations and meetings. Maguire denies the allegations. Other potential conspirators are never definitively identified in public reporting. Without documents showing explicit plans or multiple witnesses confirming every detail, newspapers may have felt the story was too risky to pursue aggressively, but the silence goes beyond simple editorial caution or the challenge of verification. Some reporters who try to follow the story encounter unusual roadblocks. Sources refuse to talk. Documents suddenly become unavailable. Phone calls are not returned. The investigation seems to dead end at every turn in ways that suggest active interference rather than lack of information. One particularly telling incident involves Paul Comley French, the journalist who accompanied Butler to one meeting with Maguire. French provides corroborating testimony to Congress, confirming that Maguire did indeed discuss plans for organising veterans and marching on Washington. French is a respected journalist with a reputation for accuracy, yet his attempts to get the story published in major outlets are repeatedly rejected. Editors tell him the story is too controversial, too difficult to verify, too risky to run without absolute proof. French ends up publishing in smaller, less prominent publications, where his reporting reaches a fraction of the audience it would have reached in major newspapers. This pattern repeats. Journalists who want to cover the story find limited outlets willing to publish. Editors who might normally pursue a scandal of this magnitude decide it is not worth the trouble. Publishers who could demand answers instead remain silent. By mid-1935, less than a year after Butler's initial testimony, the business plot has essentially vanished from mainstream discourse. Butler continues giving speeches to veteran groups and labour organisations. His book, War is a Racket, receives some attention for its critique of the military-industrial complex, but his allegations about the coup attempt are rarely mentioned, and when they are, it is often with an implicit suggestion that he might have exaggerated or misunderstood what happened. This media silence has consequences that echo through history. Because the story disappeared so quickly, entire generations of Americans grow up never hearing about it. History textbooks do not mention it. Teachers do not discuss it. The business plot becomes one of those obscure historical footnotes that only researchers and conspiracy theorists know about. Even today, if you ask random Americans if they have heard of the business plot, the vast majority will say no. If you ask if they know who Smedley Butler was, most will not recognise the name despite his being one of the most decorated Marines in American history. Conspiracy theorists point to this silence as evidence of a cover-up. If the plot was not serious, they argue, why suppress the story? If Butler's allegations were baseless, why not expose him as a fraud through aggressive investigation? The pattern of coverage, initial reports followed by rapid silence, looks suspiciously like coordinated suppression rather than natural editorial decisions. Skeptics counter that newspapers simply moved on to other news in an era of economic crisis and global instability. Roosevelt's New Deal programs provided ongoing stories. International developments in Europe and Asia dominated headlines. The business plot, lacking dramatic developments or clear villains, simply was not compelling enough to sustain coverage. But this explanation struggles to account for the pattern. Newspapers sustained coverage of far less consequential stories. The business plot involved allegations of an attempted coup, congressional confirmation that planning occurred, and implications reaching to the highest levels of American business. This is objectively a massive story. Yet, it disappeared. Whatever the true explanation, one fact is undeniable. A congressional committee confirmed that discussions about overthrowing the government took place, and America collectively chose to forget about it. The media played a central role in that forgetting, whether through deliberate suppression, editorial caution, or simply following the lead of powerful interests who wanted the story buried. And that silence itself tells us something important about power in America. Some stories get told, some stories get amplified, and some stories, particularly those that threaten the interests of the wealthy and powerful, simply disappear. Chapter 7. The Unanswered Questions. Decades after the business plot, with the benefit of historical documents, congressional records and scholarly research, fundamental questions remain unanswered. The basic facts are not in dispute. McGuire approached Butler, conversations occurred, Congress investigated and confirmed planning took place. But the deeper questions, the ones that would actually explain what happened, remain frustratingly open. First, why recruit Butler specifically? On the surface, this makes sense. Butler is famous. Veterans trust him. His military credentials are impeccable. If you want to organise veterans into a political force, Butler is an obvious choice to lead them. But look deeper. By 1933, Butler is increasingly vocal in his criticism of corporate power and military interventions on behalf of business interests. He's giving speeches attacking exactly the kind of people who allegedly wanted to recruit him. He's not subtle about this. He's not quietly, privately grumbling. He is publicly, loudly, declaring that American military operations serve Wall Street rather than American national interests. Would sophisticated conspirators really approach someone so vocally opposed to their worldview? It seems almost incomprehensibly stupid. Unless they believed Butler's criticism was performative rather than genuine. Unless they thought Butler was positioning himself for political office and could be bought with the right offer. Unless they fundamentally misread his character. Or perhaps Butler was not the first choice. Perhaps others were approached and refused before McGuire contacted Butler. Perhaps several generals were tested to see who might be receptive. We know McGuire talked to Butler. We do not know who else might have been contacted. If the conspiracy was real and sophisticated, they would not have put all their hopes on one person. The question becomes even more intriguing when you consider timing. Why approach Butler in 1933, just months after Roosevelt takes office? Why not wait to see if opposition to the New Deal would grow naturally? Why move so quickly to such an extreme measure? The answer might be that the conspirators, if they existed, recognised a window of opportunity. The Depression had created conditions where dramatic action might be possible. Veterans were desperate and angry. Roosevelt's New Deal was controversial and threatening to established interests. Public faith in traditional institutions was shaken. If you're going to attempt a coup, early in a presidency during an economic crisis is strategically the right time. But it still required recruiting someone willing to betray their oath to the Constitution. And they chose someone who would ultimately expose them instead. Second, why did McGuire have access to funding and European contacts? This question cuts to the heart of whether the conspiracy was real or fantasy. McGuire is a bond salesman. He's not a major figure in banking or industry. He does not have personal wealth sufficient to fund an operation of the scale he described to Butler. Yet congressional investigators confirmed McGuire travelled to Europe, confirmed he visited Italy, France, and Germany. Confirmed these trips occurred when Butler said they did. International travel in the 1930s during the Depression was expensive. It required substantial funding and clear purpose. Business travellers did not casually spend months touring Europe studying political systems. So where did Maguire get the money for these trips? Who funded them? Who benefited from his research into fascist organising methods? If Maguire was acting alone, if this was just his personal fantasy, the European trips make no sense. Why would a bond salesman spend significant money studying foreign governments? What would be the point? But if Maguire was acting as an agent for wealthier interests, if someone was backing his activities, the trips make perfect sense. You send someone to study how Mussolini organised his black shirts, how Hitler built the SA and SS, how fascist governments structure paramilitary forces and maintain control. You gather information about what works. Then you apply those lessons to the American context. Maguire spoke confidently to Butler about accessing weapons and equipment. He discussed organising hundreds of thousands of veterans. He referenced financial backers with resources. Either he was delusional and none of this was real, or someone was providing him with backing and assurances. The Congressional Committee did not, or could not, trace the money conclusively. But the fact that Maguire had resources beyond his personal means is not disputed. Someone enabled his activities. The question is who? Third, why did Congress confirm planning but pursue no charges? This is perhaps the most frustrating unanswered question. The committee's final report explicitly states that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed, were planned, and might have been placed in execution if financial backers deemed it expedient. That language is not ambiguous. That is not a careful statement designed to neither confirm nor deny. That is an explicit confirmation that serious planning occurred, yet no prosecutions follow. No major figures are even publicly named in the official report. The Justice Department, which could have brought charges based on congressional findings, takes no action. The FBI, which could have investigated further, does not pursue the matter. Why? Several theories exist. Perhaps evidence was insufficient for criminal convictions. Conspiracy to commit treason requires proving intent and concrete actions toward execution. Conversations and planning, however serious, might not meet the legal threshold for prosecution. Maguire denied the allegations. Other potential conspirators were never definitively identified. Without explicit documentation or multiple witnesses, convictions might have been impossible to secure. Perhaps Roosevelt made a calculated political decision. Prosecuting wealthy business leaders during the Depression could have destabilized the economy further. It could have deepened the divide between business and government at a time when cooperation was needed. It might have created martyrs and sympathy for people Roosevelt wanted to marginalize politically. Better, perhaps, to expose the plot just enough to prevent it from proceeding, then let it fade rather than creating a sensational trial. Or perhaps more sinister forces were at work. Perhaps powerful interests exerted pressure. Perhaps threats were made, implicitly or explicitly. Perhaps evidence disappeared. Perhaps witnesses were discouraged from cooperating. Perhaps the investigation was allowed to proceed only so far before being quietly shut down to protect people who could not be touched. We do not know. The reasoning behind the decision not to prosecute was never publicly explained. We have the committee's conclusion, but not their rationale for what did not happen next. Fourth, why were names shielded? Congressional committees usually name names. Investigations into corruption, propaganda, and criminal activity typically identify perpetrators explicitly. When Congress investigates corporate wrongdoing or political corruption, they name the corporations and the individuals involved. The business plot investigation does not follow this pattern. The final report refers to certain persons and financial backers without providing specifics. Butler names Gerald Maguire and references connections to Wall Street interests and major corporations. But the official report omits most names. This could be standard procedure when evidence is circumstantial. Naming someone without proof sufficient for conviction opens the committee to libel concerns and political retaliation. Perhaps the committee felt they had enough evidence to confirm planning occurred, but not enough to name specific backers without risking legal consequences. Or perhaps names were shielded deliberately to protect powerful figures. Perhaps committee members received pressure from people with influence. Perhaps deals were made. Confirm the basic facts, but do not name names, and in return certain political considerations will be arranged. The selective disclosure pattern, confirming a conspiracy existed while obscuring who was responsible, is consistent with protecting the powerful while appearing to take the allegations seriously. Fifth, how serious was the plan? Butler describes detailed conversations about recruiting veterans, marching on Washington, and installing a Secretary of General Affairs to effectively replace Roosevelt. Maguire allegedly discusses logistics, funding, and European precedents. Congressional investigators confirm that planning occurred. But was this ever operationally viable? Could 500,000 veterans actually be recruited? Would they truly march on Washington at Butler's command? Would the military stand aside? Would the public accept it? Would Roosevelt simply resign under pressure? Skeptics argue the plan was absurd from the start. The logistics alone would be overwhelming, the political obstacles insurmountable, the risk of failure catastrophic. Even if some wealthy figures entertained the idea, even if Maguire was genuinely trying to recruit Butler, the conspiracy could never have succeeded. But this analysis assumes rational calculation. The 1930s were not a rational time. Fascist coups were succeeding across Europe in countries with stronger democratic traditions than many people realised. Mussolini took power in Italy, a country with a constitutional monarchy and parliamentary system. Hitler was elected and then dismantled democratic institutions in Germany, a modern industrial nation with sophisticated civil society. If it could happen there, why not America? Veterans were desperate. The economy was devastated. Faith in democratic institutions was weakened. Roosevelt was implementing policies that terrified the wealthy elite. The conditions for authoritarian movements were present, and Butler himself took it seriously. He did not dismiss Maguire as delusional. He did not laugh off the approach. He gathered information, reported it to Congress, and testified under oath that he believed a genuine attempt to overthrow the government was being planned. Butler spent his entire adult life in military service. He understood operational planning. He knew the difference between fantasy and feasible operations, and he concluded this was the latter. Whether the plot would have succeeded if Butler had agreed remains speculation. But the fact that a decorated general believed it was serious enough to expose tells us it was not merely theoretical discussion over drinks at a club. Chapter 8. What Conspiracy Researchers Believe. In the decades since the business plot, researchers operating outside mainstream academic history have developed extensive theories about what really happened. It is important to distinguish these interpretations from established documented facts, but it is equally important to understand why these theories persist and what they suggest about hidden power structures in America. Mainstream academic history generally treats the business plot as an interesting but ultimately minor episode, something that was discussed, something that revealed anxiety among elites about the New Deal, but nothing that ever came close to succeeding. A curiosity rather than a crisis. Conspiracy researchers see something much darker, and their interpretation deserves serious consideration because it explains patterns that mainstream history struggles to account for. Their reading goes something like this. In 1933, a group of powerful industrialists and bankers recognized that Roosevelt's New Deal posed an existential threat to their wealth and power. They looked at fascist governments in Europe and saw a model that preserved corporate interests while crushing labour movements and socialist organising. They decided that America needed similar leadership. These men were not fringe extremists. They were pillars of American business. They controlled banks, corporations, manufacturing. They had access to resources that most people cannot even conceptualize. And they were genuinely terrified that Roosevelt was implementing socialism that would destroy everything they had built. They began planning a coup, not a violent revolution with tanks in the streets. That would be too risky, too likely to backfire. Something more subtle and more brilliant. a massive demonstration of veteran support that would intimidate Roosevelt into accepting a power-sharing arrangement. Present it as saving America rather than overthrowing democracy. Frame it as patriots preventing socialist destruction rather than corporate interests protecting profits. The genius of the plan, if it existed, was its potential legitimacy. If you can get the most decorated general in American history to lead 500,000 veterans to Washington, if they claim to be saving the Constitution from Roosevelt's violations, if they present themselves as patriots rather than traitors, you might actually succeed. The optics would be powerful, the implicit threat would be overwhelming, and Roosevelt might calculate that resistance would cause civil war. They needed a leader credible enough to command veteran loyalty. They chose Butler, not realizing his criticisms of corporate power were genuine rather than political positioning. They approached him carefully, testing his receptiveness through increasingly explicit conversations. Maguire was not the architect. He was a recruiter, someone expendable if things went wrong. The real backers remained hidden, insulated by layers of deniability. If Butler had agreed, they would have revealed themselves, providing the funding and support necessary to execute the operation. If he refused, Maguire would take any fallout while the real conspirators remained untouchable. Butler recognized what was happening and made a calculated decision. He would continue meeting with Maguire, gathering information, learning as much as possible about the conspiracy. Then he would expose it in a way that made execution impossible. His testimony to Congress served multiple purposes. It revealed the plot, making it impossible to proceed. It created a historical record that could not be completely erased. It warned America about the danger of corporate fascism, and it forced the conspirators to retreat and abandon their plans. Congress confirmed the plot was real, but declined to prosecute because naming the conspirators would reveal just how high the corruption reached. Imagine the testimony in a trial. Imagine major corporate executives being questioned under oath about planning to overthrow the government. Imagine the destabilization of business confidence during the Depression. Imagine the political crisis if America's wealthiest families were exposed as attempted coup plotters. Roosevelt made a pragmatic decision. Expose the plot enough to prevent execution, but do not push for prosecutions that would tear the country apart. Let the warning stand. Let the conspirators know they were caught. But do not create the spectacle of a trial that would dominate headlines for years. So the story was buried. Media coverage was suppressed through a combination of ownership interests, advertising pressure, and direct intervention. Butler became marginalised as a controversial figure whose allegations might have been exaggerated, and America forgot how close it came to authoritarianism. This narrative is compelling. It explains the unanswered questions. It accounts for the media silence. It makes sense of why Congress confirmed planning but pursued no charges. It presents Butler as a hero who saved democracy at personal cost. But is it true? Academic historians remain sceptical. They point out the lack of direct evidence linking specific wealthy individuals to explicit coup planning. They note that Maguire's conversations with Butler, while suspicious, do not prove a concrete operational plan with funding committed and timelines established. They observe that organising 500,000 veterans would require logistics that no evidence suggests existed. They propose alternative explanations. Perhaps Maguire was exploring ideas on behalf of business interests, testing whether such a plan was feasible, but never received authorization to actually proceed. Perhaps wealthy elites entertained dangerous fantasies about removing Roosevelt without ever committing to action. Perhaps Butler misinterpreted conversations or Maguire exaggerated his connections to seem more important. The truth likely falls somewhere between complete conspiracy and complete dismissal. Something real was happening. Maguire was not acting in total isolation. Powerful interests opposed to Roosevelt were exploring options, perhaps more seriously than they would later admit. Whether those explorations constituted an operational coup attempt or merely dangerous speculation remains genuinely uncertain. But consider what we know for absolute certain. Butler believed he was being recruited for a coup. He took the threat seriously enough to testify under oath before Congress. Congress investigated and confirmed that attempts to establish a fascist organisation were discussed, were planned, and might have been executed if backers chose to proceed. That confirmation from Congress is not speculation. That is official documented fact in the congressional record. Something serious enough to generate that statement from a congressional committee investigating un-American activities actually happened. The conspiracy researcher interpretation might not be entirely correct in every detail, but it is not baseless paranoia. It is built on documented facts that mainstream history struggles to explain. The European trips, the conversations, the congressional confirmation, the lack of prosecutions, the media silence. Whether you call it a conspiracy or a near miss, whether you believe it was fully operational or merely exploratory, one thing is undeniable. American democracy faced a threat from within, from people with power and resources, and only Butler's refusal prevented us from discovering how serious that threat truly was. Chapter 9. America's Forgotten Warning. No coup occurred. No government fell. Franklin Roosevelt completed his first term and was elected 3 more times, serving longer than any president in American history. The wealthy interests that opposed him adapted, finding other ways to exercise influence through lobbying, propaganda, and political opposition. American democracy survived. So why does the business plot matter almost 90 years later? Because a decorated general went to Congress and said, "This was real." And Congress responded, "It was discussed, it was planned, and it might have happened." That exchange represents one of the most remarkable and troubling moments in American history. A moment when the unthinkable was considered by people with power. A moment when the mechanisms of a coup were explored in detail. A moment when America came closer to authoritarianism than most people will ever realise. Butler's warning was not just about a specific plot by specific people. It was about something deeper and more enduring. The danger of concentrated wealth, the threat of corporate power to democratic institutions, how economic crisis creates opportunities for authoritarian solutions, and how quickly democracy can be threatened when enough powerful people decide it no longer serves their interests. In his later speeches and writings, Butler emphasized these systemic themes. He described in detail how business interests shape military policy, how wars are fought to benefit corporations while ordinary soldiers die, how the machinery of government serves wealth rather than citizens. His book, War is a Racket, published in 1935, remains one of the most powerful critiques of militarism ever written by an American military officer. In it, he calculates profits made by corporations during World War I while soldiers died in trenches. He lists companies that made fortunes from military contracts. He proposes radical reforms, including that only soldiers who will actually fight should be allowed to vote on whether to go to war. It is devastating, angry, and written by someone who spent 33 years serving the system he is now exposing. But beyond his anti-war message, Butler's testimony about the business plot carried a different warning that is even more relevant today. Democracy is fragile. It is not guaranteed by documents or traditions. It survives only when people actively defend it. When enough powerful people feel threatened by democratic decisions, they will seek alternatives. And if those alternatives involve military force, the presence of trained personnel and sympathetic officers can make the unthinkable possible. This warning echoes through history with disturbing consistency. Coups have succeeded in other democracies. Business interests have overthrown governments in other countries, often with American support. Chile in 1973, when a democratically elected socialist president was overthrown and replaced with a military dictatorship backed by corporate interests. Iran in 1953, when a democratically elected leader who nationalised oil was removed in a coup orchestrated by American and British intelligence at the behest of oil companies. America's immunity to such forces is not guaranteed by virtue of being America. It is guaranteed only by vigilance, by the willingness of people in positions of power to choose principle over profit, democracy over dictatorship. The business plot failed because Butler exposed it, but consider the counterfactual. What if Butler had agreed? What if he had believed Maguire's arguments about saving America from Roosevelt's socialism? What if he had been more concerned about communist revolution than corporate coup? What if he had led those veterans to Washington? Would the military have fired on American veterans led by the most decorated Marine in history? Would Roosevelt have capitulated rather than risk civil war? Would the American people have accepted it as necessary to save the country from radical change? Would history record it as a legitimate correction to government overreach rather than a coup? We cannot know. History does not reveal its alternative paths. But the fact that we can ask these questions, that a scenario existed where a different decision by one man might have fundamentally altered American government, should be sobering. What we know is that democracy survived, that Butler chose transparency over conspiracy, that Congress confirmed his story even if they took no further action, that America, at least this once, stepped back from the edge. But the edge was there, the possibility existed, and the fact that this moment has been largely forgotten is itself a kind of failure. Collective amnesia about threats to democracy makes those threats more likely to recur. Butler died in June 1940 of cancer at age 58. He died before America entered World War II, before his warnings about war profiteering would be forgotten in patriotic fervour. His testimony about the business plot had already faded from public memory. Today, most Americans have never heard of Smedley Butler. History classes rarely mention him beyond perhaps a footnote in discussions of American imperialism. The business plot is unknown to the vast majority of citizens. It is a curiosity for researchers, a conspiracy theory for some, a forgotten footnote for most. Yet his story deserves to be remembered and taught and discussed, not because it proves some grand conspiracy that controls all aspects of American government, not because it validates paranoid beliefs about shadowy cabals running the world, but because it reveals a profound truth about power. When those who have it feel threatened, they will consider options that seem unthinkable in calmer times. Butler saw such an option being considered. He was offered a role in executing it, and he chose to speak rather than participate. In doing so, he may have prevented one of the greatest crises in American history. The story also reveals how power protects itself. No prosecutions, names shielded, media silence, the story buried. The lesson is clear. You can plan a coup in America and walk free as long as you're wealthy enough and connected enough and the plan never quite reaches execution. That lesson should disturb us. It should make us question. It should make us vigilant. Because the conditions that made the business plot possible, that made powerful people consider overthrowing democracy, those conditions recur throughout history. Economic crisis, political polarization, fear of change, powerful interests threatened by reform. These conditions exist now. They will exist in the future. And each time they exist, someone will consider whether democracy is worth preserving, or whether authoritarian solutions would better serve their interests. Butler's choice to expose rather than execute reminds us that individuals matter, that conscience matters, that when confronted with offers of power in exchange for betraying principles, how we respond shapes history. Final question. So what was the business plot? Was it a genuine coup attempt by America's wealthiest men, a fully operational plan with funding and logistics in place that failed only because Butler exposed it? Was it exploratory conversations that never approached actual implementation? Wealthy men entertaining dangerous fantasies but never seriously committing to action? Or was it something in between, a conspiracy that existed in potential, that could have become real if circumstances aligned, and Butler had agreed, that died because one man chose democracy over dictatorship? The evidence supports all three interpretations to varying degrees. Congressional testimony confirms discussions occurred. Logic suggests operational realities would have made execution difficult. The absence of prosecutions indicates either insufficient evidence or protection of powerful interests. What cannot be debated is this. In 1934, people with resources and connections discussed overthrowing the American government. They identified a military leader to recruit. They explored logistics and funding. They studied European fascist movements for organisational models. And they came close enough to implementation that a congressional committee investigated, confirmed planning occurred, and stated explicitly that execution might have followed if financial backers deemed it expedient. That alone makes the business plot one of the most significant forgotten moments in American history, not because it succeeded, because it was attempted, because it came close enough to make a decorated general risk his reputation to expose it, because Congress confirmed it happened and then America collectively chose to forget, and because it reminds us that democracy's survival is never inevitable. It requires people who choose principle over power. It requires transparency over conspiracy. It requires recognition that some offers, no matter how they are presented, no matter what justifications are provided, must be refused. Smedley Darlington Butler was offered a chance to become the most powerful man in America. He was promised the loyalty of hundreds of thousands of veterans. He was told he would be saving the country from disaster, protecting the Constitution from socialist overreach, preventing communist revolution. He said no. He said no, and then he exposed what was being planned, knowing it would make him enemies among the most powerful people in America, knowing it might cost him his reputation, knowing mainstream media might dismiss him, knowing history might forget him. He said no because he understood something that the conspirators did not, that betraying democracy, even to supposedly save it, is still betrayal, that some principles cannot be compromised regardless of justification. That oath to the Constitution means something more important than personal power or financial reward. And perhaps that simple refusal, that choice to speak rather than participate, is the most important part of the story. Not the conspiracy itself, but the fact that when confronted with it, one man chose not to participate, chose to risk everything to expose it, chose country over personal advancement. History is shaped by such choices more than we realise. Great forces and economic conditions and social movements all matter. But so do individual decisions at critical moments. Butler's decision to expose the business plot rather than lead it represents one of those critical moments. The business plot failed because Butler made the right choice. The question for every generation is whether, when faced with similar choices, when offered power in exchange for principles, when told that betraying democracy is actually saving it, we will do the same. Will we recognise the offer for what it is? Will we have the courage to refuse? Will we risk reputation and comfort to expose conspiracies against democracy? Or will we rationalise, justify, convince ourselves that this time is different, that extraordinary circumstances require extraordinary measures, that the ends justify the means? Butler chose. He chose well. And democracy survived. That is the warning he left us. That is the lesson we forgot. That is the story that needs to be remembered.